Discussions in Depth Psychology is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. Your host is Bonnie Bright. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Discussions in Depth Psychology, which is powered by Pacifica. I'm Bonnie Bright. I'm your host, and this series is dedicated to bringing you discussions with some of the individuals who are making really important contributions in the field of depth psychology. And my guest today is Nely Galán, who is an immigrant and also a self-made media mogul and the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Self-Made, Becoming Empowered, Self-Reliant, and Rich in Every Way. Welcome, Nely. Thanks so much for spending some time with me today.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and to speak to everyone. I'm excited.
Well, I'm really honored to have a chance to talk to you and learn more about your work because you're doing some really exciting things. But let me share more about your background first for our audience, and then we'll jump into the conversation.
Great.
Nely Galán is a self-made media mogul, as I mentioned. Dubbed the Tropical Tycoon by the New York Times Magazine, she was the first Latina president of entertainment for a U.S. television network, which was Telemundo. She's an Emmy Award-winning producer of over 700 episodes of television in Spanish and English, which she produced through her multimedia company, Galán Entertainment. Galán is the founder of the Adelante movement, which seeks to empower and train Latinas and multicultural women economically and entrepreneurially. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Self-Made, Becoming Empowered, Self-Reliant, and Rich in Every Way, published by Random House in 2016. And the book is about the revolution in women's entrepreneurship led by multicultural women in the U.S. and emerging women around the world. So, Nely, you've had such an impressive career. It's really amazing to see all that you've accomplished so far, and I know that you are working on some new projects. We just mentioned your book, Self-Made, of course, and you're widely known for your success in many channels around the U.S. and the world. And you've been interviewed by people like Barbara Walters and Larry King. You've been featured in People magazine. Your company, Galán Entertainment, has helped launch 10 different television channels in various parts of the world. You're really a living example of the self-made individual. And yet, you went back to school somewhat later in life to get master's and doctorate degrees in the clinical psychology program at Pacifica. So I'm really curious about what it was that you thought psychology or depth psychology could contribute to a life that really virtually everyone would already see as being really wildly successful.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you realize in life is you're on these paths of success, and yet so many things about the journey of success don't make you happy. And I think that I was in one of those places where I had run a TV network, I had produced a lot of shows, I had made money. And in 2008, when the economy crashed, I had a company with, 70 employees and hundreds of employees working freelance. And in a weird way, a bad moment came where my company, for the first time, a lot of our deals were frozen in 2008, everybody remembers. And in a way, I felt relief. And I felt like my heart and my soul was yearning for something else. I was in this little hamster in a cage running around, and I thought, oh my God, maybe this is an opportunity for me to grow. And I had always thought if I had to do my life over again, I would have gone to psychology school. And my husband at the time said to me, if you were to die in a year, what would you do? And I said, I'd go back to school. And he goes, then go back to school. And it was, again, a window of opportunity because the entire industry was kind of in a bad place. And so it wasn't like, I was such a type A responsible person. If I had a million shows going at the same time, I would have never just conked out and left. But it was a window, and I took it, and Pacifica was a place that had been in my mind and in my heart because I had heard a lot about it through the years, since I had gone to therapy and I knew the power of psychology and the power of therapy for myself. I just really took a leap and a plunge and applied and went. So it was an incredible opening for me that really changed my life. I think everything that I've done since I would have never done. By the way, when I say I went back to Pacifica, I didn't go back to Pacifica right in 2008 because I hadn't even finished my BA. So I had to go finish my BA and then commit to going to Pacifica to get my MFT. So it was a real commitment to change my life. And I did it. And I think it's the best thing I've ever done.
Yeah, wow. I'm really excited to hear you talk about that because it really was a leap. And leaving or at least taking a pause from a successful career, even though that opportunity was sort of granted to you by the universe, I guess you could say, it's amazing that you would actually follow up and do it, especially when you had to finish your bachelor's degree, because that's no small feat in itself. And so you were really starting at a point that maybe not everybody would have been willing to do, and yet you went through it. And you entered the clinical psychology program at Pacifica, and you knew Pacifica had an emphasis in depth psychology. Well, I'm curious what it was about depth psychology that actually called to you, as opposed to maybe choosing either a different school than Pacifica or a different kind of psychology to focus on.
That's a great question. I think it was really very clear to me that, I had been in a career, and I don't even think I could articulate then what I'm articulating now because, sometimes when we're going through something, we can't really even say what it is we're going through until later, right? Mm-hmm. But in hindsight, I think that I was very confused and feeling incongruent because I was in a field where so much of what I did was based on a certain type of success that wasn't journey-oriented. So in other words, I would make a TV show, and it was a horrible experience working on the TV show with some actor or actress or whatever, but the show was a success, and I would get rewarded for that by people telling me, go make 20 more of those, when in fact it was a horrible experience. Other times, you make a program or a TV show that was so fulfilling and so deep and so profound, and then they didn't think enough people watched it, and it was kind of like poo-pooed, and then let's forget that ever happened. And I think to a psyche of a human being, that's very confusing because you're getting rewarded for something that maybe you don't really want, but people keep telling you to do more of it because, again, it's that very American point of view of success. I think as a Latina, when I went back to school, I realized that the values that I was raised on that were success values were different than what my culture thought was success. And it got to the point where my body humanly couldn't take it anymore. And I think I was blessed that I had already had some money put away and that when I was, and this is really the basis of my book, that when I made money, I didn't live grandiose. I stuck to my Latino heritage and I put money away and I invested it and I was able to really take a break, a proper break. And I think that depth psychology and going deeply and being very introspective and really also looking at diversity, looking at my own diversity and how that's seen in the workplace and how that's seen in a field that's pretty superficial but yet very lucrative. How do you deal with all of that? That's a depth issue if I've ever heard one.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a common archetypal theme, that idea of the wounded healer. And of course, there's a lot of archetypal things in what you're saying. I'm just seeing so many. But you mentioned how you were kind of in the middle of your life when this began happening for you. And of course, this is something that a lot of people who know Jung's work know, that he talked about how that yearning for something more, for wholeness, actually comes on us, usually around about midlife, because we've managed to achieve by then some success in other parts of life, and there is something that's deeper calling to us. And so I can see how that pattern popped up in your life. It also occurred in mine as well. Then you also mentioned how you said that your body just couldn't take that pace anymore. And so this whole idea of listening to the body and being embodied and paying attention to the physical aspect of it is really important. And then the third thing that I see, which actually might be a really interesting way to move to the next question I have for you, is the whole idea of the cultural diversity and the difference between cultures that you mentioned. And how in your career it was very fast-paced, I take it. It was very goal-oriented and you were constantly seeking or choosing to create that success that you were seeing. And yet it was not completely rewarding or fulfilling for you. And for me, that really points to a very, I guess what we call in depth psychology at least, more of a masculine-oriented approach, which is so prevalent in our culture as opposed to a more reflective, receptive, or even more of a kind of circular or cyclical kind of movement and motion. And so I wonder if you can share a little bit more about how that circular or reflective kind of process contributed to the next step that you took, both while you were at Pacifica and then also beyond.
Yeah, I think there is, maybe I have to write about this next too. There's a real revelation when you realize happiness and money don't go together, and also sometimes things that you dream about, when you actually get to execute them, they're not what you thought they would be. And so there is this shift when you realize, what is it that actually makes me happy? And sometimes it's really simple things, and sometimes it's time. And time is very undervalued in a success-oriented society. And I think that for multicultural people, and particularly women, where we are very journey-oriented and relationally oriented, it's very difficult for us to find happiness solely in a transactional life. And a lot of success in this country, as you said, is very masculine, patriarchal, and transactional. People are only around you if you can do something for them, or if you're somebody, or if you've achieved something. And that is the opposite of how people that are indigenous or people that are from traditional cultures are raised.
Yes, and I think that the fact that men were the hunters and were always seeking to kill the prey and procure the food in the tribe is important, because the women were, on the other hand, the gatherers, and were able to move in different ways. Like even the physical movement that they made in accomplishing what it was that they were doing was very different. And I think time moved differently for them as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, the other thing that I found very interesting, going back to why I ended up doing what I did, is I also noticed in psychology school that the conversation of diverse people and psychology was still in its infancy. You know, people were starting to talk about it in a deep way, but I felt like there were a lot of missing pieces of the puzzle, a lot of misunderstanding of how cultural people think and what is depth psychology, or what could be depth psychology for multicultural people, including starting with something as simple as the D, as when it's translated connotatively doesn't really work. So I thought, how can psychologists around the world deal with these different cultures when there's so many gaps in how we deal with multicultural people psychologically? So all of that was like sort of ringing in my head.
Yeah, well, it's great. It's really a cornucopia, I guess you could say, to bring into a program then, especially one that's focused on clinical psychology with a depth psychological aspect to it. And so not to skip too far ahead, because I'd like to hear a little bit more about Pacifica and your experience there, but your book, Self-Made, was published in 2016, as we mentioned. That was after your time at Pacifica, and so I'm curious about how that book came about. Was it a function of things that you learned and experienced while you were at Pacifica?
Yeah, I could never have written that book if I had not been there, because I wrote my thesis about the psyche of multicultural women in this moment. And so it was really a study of how we are treating multicultural women psychologically today, and what are the different techniques that we use, and where are we missing the boat. And so I think that, first of all, having come from television, I think the first professor I had at Pacifica, the first week I was there and we were asked to write something, we were laughing because he said to me, you write a little bit like a rapper, because in television you write in very pithy marketing sort of ways. And he gave me Strunk and White. And he's like, I think you're going to have to learn to write all over again, because you're going to have to write like an academic. So the discipline it took to humble myself, to be in a place where nobody really cared what I did before, to go back to learning how to write all over again, to writing 97 papers in 2 years and writing a thesis. First of all, that discipline and the research I had to do and all of that really, I think, took me to a higher place. Number two, I think that having my thesis be about multicultural women made me uncover all the writing that's out there about depth psychology and multicultural women in particular. And what I realized is that a lot of multicultural women don't go to therapy, will not go to therapy, and actually believe therapy is for crazy people, because in our cultures, that's how it's portrayed. And so I guess the question came up in my mind, how do we solve that problem? How do we create an environment that feels safe, and maybe we don't call it therapy? How do we do it? I think that was the problem, and I was looking for a solution the entire time I was there.
Well, that's a really unique approach, and I think you're absolutely right. There's so much need for something like that in the world. I mean, there's a lot of stigma that's related to therapy in many different circles, And so choosing to really start looking at that and figuring out how to approach it is just a very meaningful process. And of course, that leads me to ask you the question, what did you find out? Was the book Self-Made a function of that? And is it related to therapy? And then how does that tie into the idea of being self-made and successful?
So what I did in my thesis is I basically, as we do in thesis, look at kind of everything that's been written and what's going on, starting with Latinas, and then I branched out to other multiculturals, but I started with my own culture. The conclusion I came to is that there was this desire for a group experience, that when psychology works in Latino families, it's when people are either designated to go to family system therapy or when there's some kind of a group experience. Because so much of our culture hasn't been brought to the light, there's still a lot of secrets. And so I decided that I had the ability to create incredible group experiences with Latinas. Number one, because of my experience as a TV producer. And number two, because I had an incredible Rolodex of Latinas that were kind of hidden figures that people in our community didn't know about. And I also, it's so weird because today now with everything that's going on with the Me Too movement, I also felt that Latinas needed a place where they could feel vulnerable and comfortable with each other. And so I created a tour and I created a movement called the Adelante movement. And Adelante in Spanish means move forward. And I thought, you know what, before I go back to work, this is going to be my give back to my community. And they were events all over the country that I hosted. I partnered with a lot of nonprofits, and I hosted these events that were basically an opportunity for Latinas to come and meet Sandra Cisneros, who's our Maya Angelou, or Sonia Sotomayor, or women that I knew that were very successful, but that I knew were vulnerable and that I knew had gone to therapy and that I knew would talk about it. And we all basically did these events where we would tell our stories, and then we would invite the women in the audience to tell their stories. And so think of it as like, really, they were group experiences, and I did it for free. And, you know, I was kind of like, I don't know if this is going to work. It was so successful that we would invite 500 women, and then 1,000 women would come. And I ended up spending from 2012 to 2015 on the road, and we started out only with Latinas, but the Latinas would bring their Muslim girlfriend, their Chinese girlfriend, their Black girlfriend, and they became very multicultural events. And I realized, oh my God. And again, after hearing so many stories of so many women, the big common denominator with all of them is that they felt trapped in so many relationships, in so many bad job situations, because they had not fully become financially self-reliant. And I realized that there was a doorway to using cognitive behavioral therapy to talk about real action orientation around financial literacy and self-reliance that would lead them to be able to take the next steps to work on the rest of their lives. And the work that I did on the road and the data that I collected from these women became the book Self-Made.
Oh, that's so powerful. It's really exciting to hear that, because what you're describing is really a process that began in community and then grew to a very diverse community and then, of course, a global community, it sounds like. And that global community is really made up of people who could take advantage of this from wherever they were or from any culture around the world.
Yeah.
And then it became, as you said, more of a movement, which indicates that there really was something there that you were able to tap into, a real need or something that was up and available, some kind of potentiality. And so as we begin to look at this as a cultural and community kind of movement, what really started as a grassroots movement, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
The fact that you added the therapy into it or based it on therapy, that it was rooted in therapy, I think it's really powerful. And it's powerful because we're able to see how much psychotherapy actually can contribute to very relevant topics and situations and challenges that we're all facing today, both as women, but also the men who are out there who are facing similar challenges.
Yeah.
And certainly there's a lot of groups that are marginalized too, people of all kinds who just don't feel that they've been able to escape that trap that you talked about. And so Are you able to give us more of a concrete kind of example or viewpoint of what exactly happened in those groups, or how the CBT, as you called it, the cognitive behavioral therapy, was actually applied within the group?
Well, first of all, I think the most powerful part of the groups was hearing very successful women that these women admired talk about their problems, talk about when they felt suicidal, when they felt like they had been abused, when they felt like they didn't belong in this country, and all talking about how they had gone to therapy and why therapy worked for them and why the way we were talked to about therapy wasn't true. So I think just declaring the stories opened the door for other people to feel like, well, this has happened to me and blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't like the whole thing was a big propaganda for therapy either. It was more like, in passing, we'd say, well, we've all gone to therapy, and if we had to do our lives over again, we'd start earlier, you know? And so it created a conversation around getting help, around not being alone, about being able to share your problems with other people in a safe environment. We had strict rules of safety within these large groups. And so, you know, again, in depth psychology, it created that safe and that sacred space for work to begin. We started out just kind of having that be the beginning of it, and then we asked them what they were looking for, and they were like, we want concrete help as well. So that's where the CBT kicks in. It's like they were looking for real direction of, okay, step one, you're going to work on changing your mindset that this is what you're looking for. We're going to give you information on how you can make money while you go to school, or how do you take action when we're here? How do you go home and take action? And then the way that we continue the relationship, and I think this is very interesting for psychologists, because in the new world, we all have to think differently. Everything doesn't have to look like sitting in a chair with a client. The way we did it is we created a website and we created a newsletter where we would continue the conversation with all these women by newsletter, and then create webinars where we would say, okay, this week we're going to all work on this. Tell us how you're doing with this. Are you feeling better? Are you feeling less victimized? So we use the digital age to enhance the experience and to continue the relationship from afar.
It's such a creative approach and so powerful. And what I'm really getting from that is that, well, first of all, the therapy creates the container, as you said, the sacred space. And so you have that boundary, that space within it in which you can work. And then, of course, the stories really help create the context, because people can share one another's stories and they can begin to locate themselves within that context. And then, of course, from there, it just seems like anything is possible. So then, having the guidance of therapists and others who are able to lead people through the steps and the processes that need to happen in order for them to create change, it just seems like a very natural next step. And again, it's just such a creative approach. I'm really not surprised that it took off. And I would imagine that a lot of practicing therapists and psychologists would maybe have something to learn from the book Self-Made that they could apply in their own practice. Is there something more that you can say about that?
Well, I think going back to the idea that we're wounded healers, I mean, often I meet therapists that are so magical and do such incredible work for their clients, and yet they may be struggling themselves financially. They may have a hard time dealing with their practice as a business. And I think the book is very grounded in the step-by-step, not grandiose process that it takes to be self-reliant and rich in every way. And I say rich in every way, going back to the values of rich in family, rich in love, rich in spirituality, all the other things that it takes to be happy besides your economics. But certainly, I think that when you ground yourself, when money, instead of being something that is like scary or evil or something, if it's something that really you ground yourself in, I always say I'm a turtle, in the just slow way of dealing with it in a way that's very grounded, so that that money gives you the opportunities to do the kinds of things I've been able to do, like do this entire program. So right. I do believe that psychologists, first of all, they'll love it because they'll understand the CBT. They'll read between the lines, because I didn't scream psychology so much in the book, but anyone that reads it will know that someone who has studied psychology wrote it. But I think also just the grounded advice and CBT kind of steps to also always be making sure that you're taking care of yourself before you take care of others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that image of putting on the oxygen mask for yourself first when you're on an airplane before putting it on somebody else is absolutely critical. And I know that goes along with, as we mentioned earlier, taking care of yourself physically as well as spiritually, because if we aren't paying attention to our soulful needs as well, then there's really no way we can ever be fulfilled. And I think that's so much of what Jung's own theories about the ideas of what individuation stands for is really having that soulful perspective and being able to tap into that then and create the daily practices that we really need that will sustain us and fulfill us in so many different ways. Do you have some daily practices yourself that serve you that you can share with us? And maybe you can also talk a little bit about some of the people who have inspired you or who have contributed to your own perspective.
Well, definitely. I mean, I think what's changed for me from Pacifica, and I don't even know that I speak about it, but it is a daily practice. I realized after going to psychology school is my life is still the same. I still have the same issues, the same worries, the same problems show up. But I do have a filter that sort of shows up where I feel like I know how to solve this problem. I know what it is when it shows up. I know where it comes from. And I know what I have to do to get out of it. There's no problem that is so insurmountable anymore because I do have techniques that I didn't have before. I also meditate a lot. I feel like having a spiritual meditative practice really helps quiet my mind, and that's very important. And certainly the people I studied at Pacifica, Jung, because he was also such a creative person and really understanding creativity and how can you use that to solve very complex problems in a way that maybe no one else has ever thought of, but at the same time taking care of yourself so you don't go off the deep end, because sometimes creative people can go off the deep end. I really loved learning from Christine Downey about Freud, so opposite. And I have to say, Christine Downey, I think, was my biggest influence at Pacifica because she was 80 years old at the time, and I felt that she was alive and kicking like she was 30 or 40 years younger, and the most transparent and honest person that I had ever met to that point. Like, so open about her life, about her journey. And it really, I think, inspired so much of my tour and about really trying to be that honest and just raw and knowing the power and the beauty of that.
Yeah, Christine Downing, of course, who was taught in the Mythological Studies Department at Pacifica for a long time and is truly an inspiration for so many people. I know many of our listeners will be familiar with her work on mythology and on the goddess. And I know there's a lot of other people who have inspired you, but she is definitely an inspiration for me as well. As we begin to wrap up here, Nely, I'm curious about what's next for you. Are you going to continue to focus on self-made and the Adelante movement, or do you have new projects that are on the horizon that you are able to talk about right now?
I am definitely going to continue with those two projects. I am in the middle of now taking a 2 or 3 month sabbatical again because I just came from a 150 city tour around the country.
Wow.
I've done events with now Asian women, Muslim women, Black women, Middle Eastern women, men, children, families, Latinos, and it's been very intense. And in a year that's been so difficult in this country with all of the things that are going on, I feel like I need to process everything I've learned. And I guess one of the things I learned at Pacifica is to take time to process and really go inward and really deeply go to that intuitive place that tells you what is the next thing I'm supposed to do with this work, what is the next step, and also how can I take care of myself better. Because even with everything I've learned, I realize I go down the rabbit hole very quickly of putting everyone before me, and then I feel sometimes alone and lost. And so I think I need a couple of months to get myself back to then go out in the world again. Very Joseph Campbell.
So beautifully said. Beautiful idea, too. And, of course, as we're doing this interview, we're still in the winter months. So it's a really good time to think about doing that. I mean, I hope that everybody would have consciousness around that understanding of themselves and how much it's really required that we just sometimes take that time for ourselves. And finding ways to do it, even if it's in a very, very small way. I know not everybody can quit a job or stop working or stop what they're doing for their families, but to be able to at least set aside a little bit of time each day, even 5 minutes a day, to find that introspection is just critically important. So it's exciting and wonderful to hear you talk about that, and it's such a commendable project, really. But
I'll tell you, though, you have inspired me with this interview because I realized that I've been doing all this work outside of the psychology community. And I realized that I need to do more of this because I kind of speak about it in a very different way in the rest of the world. But I realize that I am incorporating all my studies, and I don't know that I get to talk about it enough. And I do think, I hope I inspire other people to realize that you can go to psychology school and that there isn't just one path to being a therapist or a psychologist,
Absolutely.
Right? And that there are very unique, creative ways to use your psychology degree to do incredible work in the world that is not in the way that you thought it would be.
Absolutely, and I love to hear you say that. It's just so, so true, and there are so many different applications, particularly of depth psychology with all of the symbolism and archetypal aspects and the therapy and the group and community work. It's just really remarkable. So it's wonderful to see what you've done with it, and I just wish you all the best. I've been speaking today with Nely Galán, who's an immigrant and, of course, a self-made media mogul, also a graduate of the clinical psychology program at Pacifica. And she's the author of Self-Made, Becoming Empowered, Self-Reliant, and Rich in Every Way. And you can find out more about Nely on her website at nelygalan.com. That's spelled NelyGalan.com. And there's more about the book at becomingselfmade.com. And of course, we mentioned the Adelante movement, which is for multicultural women, and that's at theadelantemovement.com. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Nely.
Bonnie, thank you so much. What a beautiful interview. And thank you to Pacifica, who created a beautiful environment for all of us to grow and to come up with all of these new journeys.
You've been listening to Discussions in Depth Psychology, powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute with host Bonnie Bright. Learn more at pacificapost.com or at pacifica.edu.